Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
In this week's program, possible solutions to a potential energy shortage, and lawmakers keep searching for answers on lax forfeiture laws. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. With this week's Capitol Report, I'm Julie Bartkey. A recent study released by the state's Office of Energy Security shows that over the next 15 years, Minnesota needs more power than the state can currently supply. We will highlight the findings in a moment, but first, that study was required by the state's Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. John Brune explains the framework and the powerful impact of that legislation.
Minnesota set the standard for renewable energy in 2007 with one of the country's most ambitious renewable energy laws. Most electric utility companies are now required to produce 25% of their energy from renewable sources, including wind and solar power, by the year 2025.
The standards were principally designed to do two things. One is to try to reduce the dependence on non-renewable resources, because they're going to be depleted and they're expensive and they come from other places that aren't domestic. So there's an economic impact. The second reason is related to that, which is that some of these non-renewable fossil fuels generate greenhouse gases, which is perceived as a serious environmental issue. Traditionally, utilities have been regulated for cost and reliability. So the concern was that doing this might affect the reliability of the system or the cost to ratepayers. So the legislature was very cautious and commissioned a number of studies to verify it, and also provide for off-ramps which would blink off that requirement to do the renewables if it turned out to cause excess cost or reliability issues.
Since the 2007 bill, energy legislation has mainly consisted of the fine-tuning of conservation efforts and renewable energy standards. Lawmakers, however, have looked at a variety of energy alternatives. Earlier this year, the state Senate passed a bill lifting the moratorium on the construction of nuclear power plants in Minnesota. However, the bill failed to garner support in the House. The final 2009 bill included funding for many initiatives, including home energy conservation incentives and an emphasis on solar power.
Solar is where wind was maybe 15 years ago. It's very expensive, but the fuel cost is free, and it's renewable. And so what was done was, within the utilities conservation programs, they were allowed to do more solar generation projects than before. They were granted incentives in the rate structure for rate-regulated utilities, such as Xcel. And then one of the showpieces is the central corridor, the light rail corridor between Minneapolis and St. Paul. On 1/4 mile on each side, Xcel, which is the utility there, can engage in investments in infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, such as electric vehicle, solar, digital technology, and get cost recovery from the PUC if the PUC approves.
As the state moves forward with renewable energy investment, lawmakers continue looking for ways to find cleaner and more sustainable sources of energy. Many hope that the resulting growth of a new green industry will produce more jobs and reduce Minnesota's dependence on foreign oil.
Now, the latest energy assessment study highlights 4 key findings. They are: energy demand is likely to continue growing in the future. Additional transmission is a critical need. Coal will continue to be the main fuel source for generation used in Minnesota under any foreseeable future. And finally, while new technologies will have an important impact, they are not likely to be the silver bullet. A strong proponent of renewable energy in the House joins us now to talk about this report. We have Representative Jeremy Kalin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good to see you again.
Let's begin with this Office of Energy Security report. It's called a forecasting tool for energy needs. It doesn't provide any specific recommendations for policymakers. So what do you think has to happen for Minnesotans to get the power supply that they're going to need in the next 15 years?
Well, I think first we need to understand kind of where our energy is coming from, and that's why this report is really helpful, because it's every 4 or 5 years we get a sense of what's that mix from nuclear to coal to gas to wind and solar. And then there's the sort of invisible resource that I've been working hard on as well, and that's energy efficiency. we know that energy efficiency, for instance, energy savings programs like tuning up your furnace at home or making sure you're maximizing your natural light in office buildings at work, that's about a penny per kilowatt hour as opposed to 7 cents per kilowatt hour to buy more power on the grid or to build a new plant. So I think we have to look at what are the resources we have today. How do we increase the mix of renewables and solar in there, because they're the cleanest with the least emissions generally, and then how can we make sure that we're using all those fuels as efficiently as possible through making energy efficiency the first resource.
And how do you increase what we need? Do you propose using what's already existing, or do you propose really furthering the push on renewables? But is that realistic to the extent that they're saying is necessary?
Well, I think we're seeing from the utilities that they're able to bring on enough wind and solar to meet the 25% by 2025 mandate. We just had a 1 megawatt solar project in downtown St. Paul announced. In Chisago County, we're working on a biomass fueled heat and power. It's called a combined heat and power system, so you get electricity and heat out of using things like wood waste and prairie grass. So I think we're looking at those next generation technologies actually becoming available today. Methane digesters, using the gas from our landfills to make electricity. So all across Minnesota, we have really interesting projects on the renewable side. What I think we need to do is to make sure that we're maximizing the job potential in making our economy as efficient as well. In downtown St. Paul, the Rock 10 paper recycling facility had their steam supply get cut off by Xcel, and they needed to find a new fuel source. Well, just through energy efficiency measures that with a payback of just 2 years, they've been able to keep the doors open and save 500 good-paying jobs that provide health insurance and support families. So energy efficiency is often what keeps companies open more and more as energy becomes a bigger piece of the bottom line.
Getting back to that bottom line, however, this report does state that there's going to be an additional 4,100 megawatts needed of fuel, just in baseload fuel power. So it also says that coal is really primarily the only way to get this kind of power realistically. Do you buy that argument?
I don't, because right now I mentioned that energy efficiency is about 1/7 the cost of new power. A coal plant in the South Dakota Big Stone 2 plant, that was about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Northern Iowa has a plant that was proposed at 9 cents. Why would we do the more expensive option when we can do something cheaper? It's kind of a core Minnesota value that we want to do the least cost, least harm option. But it's like having two locomotives going in opposite directions, because utilities make money by adding more power and more assets, more power lines, more power plants. They can only kind of cover their losses on the energy conservation piece, but we're working hard now to say, you know what, could we make it so they can actually make money through energy conservation?
Well, critics would also argue that this is the time to lift that moratorium on nuclear expansion, and it did pass the Senate, didn't get through the House last session. Do you see this as an option next session? We know that you're not necessarily in favor of it, but could it happen?
With all the options on the table, where we talk about everything equally, when you talk about efficiency and conservation being 1 penny per kilowatt hour, when you talk about building a new nuclear power plant, it hasn't been done in 25 years in the United States, so it's hard to put a price on it. But if you take the fact that all of us, through the Price-Anderson Act, actually taxpayers are the insurers of nuclear plants, because no private insurer would actually bear that risk, that makes that pretty expensive as well. Coal, increasingly 7-9 cents a kilowatt hour. There could be about $20 a ton carbon on top of that, so that might be 11, 12 cents. So when you do an apples-to-apples comparison like we did in the House through 7 hours of hearings in 2009, I think you start to get a sense that maybe there are other ways to meet that baseload need. I do want to say that I'm open to finding a way to do nuclear safely and economically, but we just haven't seen it.
Okay.
And so I think it becomes this big gorilla in the room that everybody wants to talk about nuclear power when I think we could just talk about all the options rather than just one.
And we could talk about this for an extended period of time, but we're just about out of time. And I want to ask you real quickly, you were just selected to chair the Clean Energy Task Force on a federal level. Congratulations on that. Now, Minnesota does have some of the strongest renewable energy standards in the nation. What are you going to take from our model that you think could work at a federal level?
I think the biggest thing we're going to bring to Washington, D.C., we were just there earlier this week. The biggest thing we're taking to Washington, D.C. is that renewable and clean energy means job creation. The last decade, the clean tech economy in Minnesota has outpaced the rest of the economy in job growth 10-1. And even in the last 2 years, the state economists and DEED's, Department of Employment and Economic Development's own numbers show that as everyone else is losing jobs, the energy and clean tech utility sectors are growing 4.5%. Almost 1,000 new jobs, almost 1,000 net increase in families that are putting bread on their table and supporting their families because of the clean tech economy. It's only going to grow faster and faster.
Okay, we're out of time, Representative Kalin. We'll catch up with you after you get back from D.C. again.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. Moving forward with transportation was the driving force behind this news conference. Governor Tim Pawlenty, alongside MnDOT Commissioner Tom Sorrell, laid out 5 transportation initiatives. He says each provides a concrete plan to alleviate congestion and look to creative funding for certain projects.
If you look at transportation reform around the country and really around the world, a lot of it relates to innovative financing similar to what we're talking about today. Minnesota and the Midwest doesn't have a tradition of toll roads, and we don't want that tradition. It's just on a very limited basis. If it makes sense to get some new capacity on min-pass style lanes, we want to explore that, but we don't see that as a cure-all. Each one of these things we think is one helpful tool, but it's certainly not the whole picture.
Here to give his perspective on this energy study, we have Senator Michael Jungbauer. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to begin with the OES study does point to coal being the main source of meeting Minnesota's power supply needs for the next 15 years as far as that base load power. Is coal, in your opinion, the best option right now?
Well, I don't think we have a lot of other options on the table today. If you look at the statistics, I mean, renewables are great. I'm all in favor of innovation, renewables, and things like that. But number one, the cost factor. But in reality, it would take 50 years to get enough renewables to have a good base load capacity off renewables. And obviously, wind is not really a base load, although battery technology, other things are new ways to store the energy are coming online. But again, we're still looking at 50 years out. And we have a lot of power needs today, so it's coal has to be a main factor.
Well, Minnesota does have 46, as of 2005, we have 46 coal-fired generating units at 21 different locations. Is this enough to provide that necessary 4,100 megawatts that we're going to need in baseload power?
We are going to be at a major deficit very soon, especially if you want the economy to grow. Now, if you want the economy to continue to shrink, and we use efficiency factors, things like that, we probably could get by. But now we see this great push towards electric hybrid cars, rechargeable cars. Where do people think the electricity comes to charge those cars? So we'll have a great deal of new stress just in those new options on the grid. And those hybrids, while they're less emissions in terms of transportation sector, they increase the emissions in terms of the coal-fired power plants. And they're of no other value until you come to a smart grid where on a smart grid you could plug in the hybrid, and when they're not using it, it could backfeed into the system off and use that battery as a storage device. But again, even the smart grid technology, we're just starting to see some of those come into major cities.
You're a strong proponent of nuclear. Would you argue that this is the time to pursue lifting that moratorium? You pushed for it last session. You actually authored one of the bills to lift the moratorium on new nuclear facilities, the expansion. So the OES report didn't even address this. So does that mean it's kind of off the table, or do you think this is the time to really push and get it back on the table?
Well, I think it is the time to push and get it back on the table. Obviously, we have the moratorium. I believe that's why the OES didn't deal with it. It's been off the table for many, many years. We need to look at every option. The problem is the anti-nuclear people, they keep talking about our current technology. Most people don't understand current nuclear technology is 1950s technology built in the 60s. I mean, my gosh, we're in 2009 here. We have safe technology built in the 60s. It is much safer, much more efficient, and doesn't have the same storage requirements in terms of spent fuel. You really don't have that kind of a spent fuel like the old-fashioned systems.
Well, Representative Kalin would argue, and did argue, that the research doesn't necessarily show that the technology is where it needs to be to lift this ban. What's your argument?
Well, apparently Representative Kalin hasn't read all the research then. Especially when you get into Africa's building a pebble bed reactor. And the pebbles are ceramic-coated nuclear fuel, and the chance of even one of those pebbles, if you will, melting down are, you know, astronomical, but then it's only a minute amount of radiation that could escape. So that's probably the best technology that's available today. But again, exponentially better than what we have today. And so to even say that, you know, it's at any risk compared to today's technology that's on the ground. I mean, I would have no problem shutting down today's technology. I don't think we should expand what we have on the ground today, but we should certainly lift the moratorium to look at new nuclear.
So is that the argument you'll present then to the House? Because the idea did pass the Senate last session.
Yes.
Not the House. Is this one of the arguments you would
That's
present?
one of the arguments is, you know, what's gone on, especially at Prairie Island. They don't want the expansion of storage of spent fuel rods. Well, we don't use the same kind of fuel in the new technology. Even when that new technology fuel is spent, it's much less amounts and easier to store. So I'm all in favor of abandoning old nuclear, but we need to replace it with obviously stable baseload and new nuclear.
Okay, I want to read something to you and get your thoughts on this. Linda Taylor, she's a former deputy commissioner from the Department of Commerce's Energy Division. She characterized the study as a report of a lame duck administration. She went on to say that we must make a more serious dent on carbon. Whoever gets elected in 2010, they've got to move forward with this. What are your thoughts?
Well, geez, I don't know if you want to get my whole thoughts on carbon.
In 1 minute or less.
CO2 is the building block of life. To the extent we reduce CO2, we reduce the ability for plants to grow. We now know with scientific certainty below 175 parts per million, everything on the face of the earth starts to die rapidly. We're at 390 parts per million. Now, when we burn fossil fuels, we emit sulfur dioxides, nitrous oxides. I'm all in favor of reducing those and changing the way we use fossil fuels today. Not a problem. Technology, other things, innovation, that's where I want to be. But to talk about carbon dioxide as though it's a pollutant is patently false. We have all the evidence. In fact, in 2009, you will find that we know all the flaws in the IPCC reports. So
getting back to the theme of this report, do you think Minnesota will be able to provide the necessary energy needs over the next 15 years at a reasonable rate?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think we'll be at a major deficit. We will climb, and pricing will obviously escalate. If cap and trade should pass, the poorest of the poor, the middle class, we will pay the highest burden on energy anywhere in the country, in Minnesota, because of our standards, and also in the world. We are putting the United States backwards in terms of economics. And again, I want to protect the environment for all it's worth, and we can do it, and we can do it cheaply, and we can move ahead.
Okay, that's another program. Senator Jungbauer, we're out of time. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Lawmakers continue to gain information on the fallout of the Metro Gang Strike Force and how to revise the structure for existing strike and task forces across the state. This latest meeting delved into current search and seizure laws.
The actions that occurred at the Metro Gang Strike Force do not reflect the overall work of law enforcement, and under no circumstances is it appropriate to paint a broad brush picture upon the actions of a relatively small number of individuals.
Legislative meetings will continue for months addressing the issues that have surfaced because of the alleged misconduct of the Metro Gang Strike Force. We sat down with Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Mee Moua, to get her inside perspective on sorting through the messy details. Senator Mee Moua, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk a little bit about the hearings with the Metro Gang Strike Force, which is now defunct. As the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you've been calling hearings. They will continue for some time, and that's the intent anyway. What kind of information, what is the intent behind these hearings? especially given the fact that the Metro Gang Strike Force is now indeed defunct?
Sure. Well, you know, when the situation broke out, the 5 co-chairs, both the House and the Senate committees with jurisdiction over the Metro Gang Strike Force and public safety got together. And we identified 2 primary goals for how we're going to very decisively respond to this situation. The one goal is to find out what went wrong and how we can help to prevent it from ever happening again. But the second goal is that we needed to move very quickly in the process of finding out what went wrong and how we repair that. We knew that we had a tremendous amount of public trust to repair and restore to our public safety people on the front line. So as a result of that, we identified 4 main areas that we needed to have further hearings. And the goal, we hope, is that after we've gone through the hearings that we need to do in those 4 areas, that we will have found out what went wrong and take some steps to address that legislatively, but also begin to repair the relationship of the public with our local law enforcement.
And how do you do that? What are some of the steps that are being taken?
So as you've seen, we've had 3 hearings so far. The first 2 hearings, our goal was to hear from the Office of our Legislative Auditor and to receive the Lugar report, to also engage the Commission of Public Safety in a conversation about what went wrong, and take the recommendations that came out of the 2 reports and ask ourselves, where do we move on from here? The second hearing, we asked specifically for the commissioner to engage in, and we directed him to go to the local law enforcement agencies that were part of this multi-jurisdiction task force, and to solicit from them what they think would work best, knowing that I think the primary reason for the Metro Gang Strike Force becoming dysfunctional and imploding is a lack of supervision and a lack of adherence to specific procedures and protocols and how they handled evidence and how they handled the work of the strike force. So we've charged and we've directed the commission to go back to talk to local law enforcement. We hope that he will bring back a recommendation, and those recommendations will be used during the legislative session very quickly early on. As we undo legislatively the Metro Gang Strike Force, we hope to be able to put together a new form, a new infrastructure to help our local law enforcement deal with the gang issue.
And you said earlier that the second goal is to try to re-engage the public and rebuild public trust. What can you do, and who are the stakeholders that need to be involved to get the public back on board and to build that trust again?
Well, so the way that we think we could demonstrate that is to ask the question, the Metro Gang Strike Force had these problems, no one talked about it. Is there anything else going on with the other strike force or the other task forces that are operating all across the state? So the most recent hearing we had was to have a conversation about those other task forces. How do you monitor them? How do you evaluate them? How do you supervise them? And bringing some of those task forces to the legislature to talk to us about how they do their work, how successful they are, and how they're performing on the front line.
And you had said before when we brought you on to Capitol Report that you believed that this was an anomaly, what happened with the Metro Gang Strike Force. As you hear from these other strike and task forces, do you still believe this?
I do. It was very affirming at the last hearing that we had to have our law enforcement officers from West Central Minnesota, from St. Cloud, from Dakota County come and describe to us how they do their work, the type of supervision that they have, how they locate their evidence rooms. So to hear directly from them how they do their work, the chain of command, the chain of supervision, it's very reassuring. It was also very helpful, I think, to hear from the Office of Justice Programs that have the responsibility to evaluate these programs, to hear about how they do their evaluation, both pre the Metro Gang Strike Force incident and now post the Metro Gang Strike Force incident, it was very good to see that they've taken some of the lessons, they've gone back, and all the strike forces or the task forces have said, we're going to reevaluate how we do our business. And if there's an opportunity here to improve, we're taking this opportunity to do that. Now, all of the ones who came to speak to us didn't need to improve. They were already doing, really great things. And so that's reassuring. And we hope that that hearing helped to allay some of the fears that what's going on with the Metro Gang Strike Force is also going on elsewhere in the state.
Do you plan to wait for recommendations from Commissioner Campion before you move forward with crafting legislation, or is this something that, at least in your head, if not on paper, you're already beginning to do to tighten up these loopholes?
No, I think that there are a number of different areas. With respect to the reformulation of a new multi-jurisdiction task force in the metro area, I would like to wait to get input and recommendation. We're dealing with multi-agencies here, and so I think that we should let the experts and the professionals, the chiefs and the sheriffs who are involved in these local agencies come back to us with some recommendations of what they think will work for them. Now, in the areas, in the other areas, so I've talked to you about two areas. There are other areas that we want to look at, and one of the big areas that I think goes towards the restoring the public trust and public faith is to look at the whole issue of seizures and forfeitures. And I know that people are very tense about this out in the communities. I think law enforcement feels like some really bad things are going to happen to them. The community feels like bad things should happen to them. Well, the fact of the matter is, I think this presents a great opportunity for us to re-examine our forfeiture and seizure laws. And the question to ask, we don't know yet. The question to ask is, do we have good laws in place? Or do we have laws that need to be tweaked, needs to be modified? That's the question. And so that will be one of the hearings, or a couple of hearings that we will have that's upcoming. And then the fourth area that I think goes a long way towards restoring the public trust is to have a very candid conversation with law enforcement and the communities of color about the relationship between the communities of color and law enforcement. I know that what took place with the Metro Gang Strike Force is unique in many, many ways. But the single most alarming theme that came out of that was that it was the perfect storm of bad situations. You had officers who are renegades without adequate supervision. They were operating all on their own, almost operating in the dark. And a number of the opportunities that it gave rise to that for arbitrary behavior to take place that targeted people in the communities of color. That's just not acceptable. So we'll use this as an opportunity to engage in that discussion. But I know that there are law enforcement agencies out there who are great operators, and it is not their intent to profile or to arbitrarily impose bad behavior on the communities of color. But there is a reality that the communities of color have encountered, that there have been incidences not just unique to the Metro Gang Strike Force, but there have been incidences in the communities where people felt like they have been treated in a way that's racially biased. And I think that it's healthy for us as a community to not be afraid to have that discussion, because only good things will come out of that.
So as we go into the 2010 session, does this all come down to good communication and collaboration between legislators and the commissioner?
Absolutely, and I think the commissioner and the legislators involved in these committees have always been on the same page. The commissioner has been upfront. The commissioner has been decisive. He has been very transparent on what it is that he wanted to do, to the degree that he has the authority to act. He has done that, and he has consulted with us, and we've been on the same page. To the extent that we may have higher expectations that are outside of his realm of authority, we can't fault him for not doing what we would like him to do. So there are some things that we have to work in conjunction with him, but I think that the commissioner has done really great work where it's in his jurisdiction purview to do.
Senator Mee Moua, thanks so much for your perspective on this issue.
Oh, thank you for having me here.
If you'd like to catch that interview or any portion of this program again, you can log on to senate.mn/media. And that's going to wrap it up for this week's program. From all of us here at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thanks for watching Capitol Report.